Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to C4C Apologetics. We're continuing on with interviews, and I think this is probably the first time I've interviewed somebody on this particular topic. And the more I really dive into this topic, the more I'm like, we got to get a guy on the channel to interview and talk about these things, because it's very important what we're going to be talking about, but not many people realize the importance of it. And so I have on Professor Tom Eckman with us today, and he's a got multiple degrees. He's got a bachelor's and a master's from Criswell. He's got, I believe, a master's as well from Capital College, and then he's got an MDiv from Grace School, and he just finished a THD from Grace as well. And so, Tom Eckman, from what I understand, you're a professor of New Testament Greek. Is that accurate? And if share a little bit about yourself with the people that are watching, listening, family, ministries, whatever you'd like. Maybe I butchered something, clarify positions. Share a little bit about yourself, Tom.
Fair enough. Fair enough. No, um, I would say I've got a strong background in Greek, obviously. Even my PhD studies were basically in Greek linguistics. But even in Bible college, I chose Criswell because they really were very much like, you need to study the New Testament Greek. And I kind of fell in love with it and found that I had some ability there. Moving forward, pretty much everything I did was geared to, increasing and helping me grow my knowledge of New Testament Greek and how it works, how it functions. But, presently, while I'm involved in probably three different teaching ministries, separate teaching ministries, the main the main thread that they have in common is that I'm trying to take ideas that are sort of up here in the ivory castles, as they say in academics, and pull it down to where it's accessible to somebody that doesn't have that kind of educational background. And not always easy to do. And I do have some people who say, you kind of over my head a little bit, but I try not to use any of the language that we're going to talk about today, probably. I try not to use any of that language, and simplify it and just make sure everybody can access it. So.
So you mentioned linguistics. So how many languages do you know?
Uh, I speak four pretty well. I speak another fairly well. I can communicate in it. And then, of course, read Greek and Hebrew. Greek a whole lot better than Hebrew, though.
So I have to ask, what are these five languages? The four that you know really well, and the one,
Yeah, English, of course, but Portuguese is Brazilian Portuguese is my
uh,
second language. Spanish, French, the Romance languages I'm familiar with. Not Italian, but I can read a lot of Italian just because of the others. And then, of course, I know enough Russian to get by. So that would be the fifth. And then, Greek and Hebrew. I just
wow.
read.
The only Italian I know is whenever I go to Olive Garden. That's about it.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
So now that's exciting. So I had you on because I want to go ahead and talk about the Greek language and the Greek New Testament, the role it plays within, the Bible student to open up just more understanding of what's being said within the scriptures as well. And so when I found out about you being on with Chris over on Golf Side, I was like, I got to get this guy on because I'm self-taught. I don't have a whole lot of Greek knowledge, Greek training. I'm trying to learn as much as possible, reading books like Merkel, Plummer, Campbell, Wallace, and things of that nature. So I've learned a little bit, but obviously I'm nowhere near what your breadth of knowledge is. And so I wanted to ask you personal questions as far as what I'm going through and things I'm trying to understand a little fuller. And I know if I'm trying to understand it, majority of people reading the Bible are trying to understand it as well. And really, the first question that I have for you as a Greek professor, and this is where you're making your living in the Greek language, but is Greek necessary to understand the Bible? Should somebody know the Greek language? Is it even necessary to understand? What are your thoughts?
I would say it's incredibly helpful, but I would say in our present culture, with sort of this idea that truth is relative, and I only really need what's practical. I only really need what feels good. the whole sort of postmodern mentality. We've lost our taste of that. But if we're getting back to the Bible as truth, and we believe that it's revealed truth,
Hmm.
then, getting to the source and understanding that it comes from a fixed source, but then when you move from this fixed source and move it across a language, there are so many variables in ways of expressing things and the expressions and the way we communicate ideas and even word order, and all of those things can affect meaning. And if you don't have any idea how Greek works, it's difficult to know whether the translators have gotten it right, almost independent of the translation. So, does it matter as far as the layperson is concerned? Not so much. But I would say if you're a pastor or you're a leader, then you get to the place where you go, well, how do I know this is what the intention of the author was? How do I know this verb should be understood in this particular way, in this particular context? And, the biggest problem that I see is people who say, well, yeah, I had a year of Greek or whatever. And so they get the first year grammar and they get to the end of the first year grammar. And they go, I got it. I can defend my position. And I can always say from now on, well, this is from the Greek. Well, that's a problem, because even if you go to syntax, which is sort of the next level, you're still working usually within a sentence.
Yeah.
When you're talking about syntax, you're not even moving to the discourse level. And there are discourse indicators that are particles in Greek that don't show up in English.
Mm,
So how do you have access to that if you don't know anything about the language or how it functions?
yeah.
And a lot of those ideas and a lot of those things that are communicated in and through the Greek,
Mhm.
um, you can capture them if you know enough, and and they will affect your perspective. I would argue.
That's true because, as far as, teaching the Bible expositionally, and right now we're going through First John. I do like to parallel. I just like using the King James. I'm a majority text type of guy, and but I do like to parallel it at times. You too.
Yeah.
I like to parallel it with the New American Standard 95, Young's Literal Translation, even well, I'll get struck, but even the ESV, the Elect Standard Version. But I like
Yeah.
parallel. But like you had mentioned, there are some verses that, like, the ESV goes a completely different way than what, like, the King James, New King James, the majority text translations go as well. And so one of them actually talks about continuing, one of them talks about just doing, period, a one time shot. And there's other aspects, and we're going to get into it later. So I'm totally with you as far as knowing a little bit about the language allows you to discern, okay, which one is accurate, which one is the best translation that we have out of all the extant manuscripts. So with
Right.
that being the case, what I've come to realize and is there's something out there called Koine Greek, I think is how it's pronounced. What is meant by the term Koine Greek, and is that different from, like, other Greek languages? Is it a type, a very what is Koine Greek?
Yes, it's was the common Greek that was spoken during the time of the writing of the New Testament.
So
So, well,
it
there's
go
there's history behind it, Homeric Greek and Attic Greek that moved up to that. It's something like saying this, in contemporary English, we can read Shakespeare with some degree of understanding, but unless you're familiar with how they communicated during the time of Shakespeare, you're going to have a tough time. I know I do.
Mhm,
I have a tough time reading the King James.
mhm.
Quite honestly, just because of the way that things are expressed. And it's very, very different than contemporary American English. So, but this Koine Greek would have been the common language that would have been understood by all Greek speakers at that
So
time.
is it just a matter of, like, Koine, does that simply mean common? Is that what
That's the
okay.
idea.
So it's
Mhm.
really just I pinpointing a particular type of Greek language that was around during the time of Christ. Is that really what it's saying? That this was the language spoken, the nuance? Okay, I'm with you.
The man on the street, sort of. Yeah.
Okay. I'm with you with the King James. That's why I love to have like the 1828 Webster Dictionary and the 16, I think the 1711 Samuel Johnson Dictionary as well. Those help a lot. The thing I like about those dictionaries is they'll give the definition, but they'll also give a verse. It's very biblical centric. And so, no, I'm with you. So, what I'm learning as far as the Greek language is there's three like parts to Greek language. From what I've understood, you have the tense, the aspect, and I think it's called the axionar or something like that.
Action smart. Yeah.
So, could you explain what are those three within the Greek language? And then of those, is there like an order of preference? Like what's the most important, least important? Can you break those down, the tense aspect and other stuff?
That's a great question. And the reason it's a great question is because that's where everybody veers off course.
Okay.
They try to play with the language as though it's all about time. And so they hear the word tense and they assume that a tense carries is embedded within the tense is the idea of time. And that's simply not true. And it will not hold up water if you study enough Greek verbs. And really, what you're talking about is the Greek verbal system, by the way. But yeah, for Greek verbs, you have this idea of time, but time is not the primary thing that's encoded in the Greek verbs. The primary thing that's encoded in the Greek verbs is actually aspect. An aspect is the idea of your reference point, either you're inside what's going on or you have a perspective that's outside of what's going on. And so, a lot of languages, including Russian, still have that what they call perfective and imperfective aspect to them. And it's almost misleading because we hear a perfect tense,
Mm-hmm.
and a perfect tense in terms of aspect is actually imperfective. So it's like you go, okay, right? So, but in any case, what you find is as you study Greek, you end up having to move away from this idea of time, which we're very time centric in the English language, past, present, future. That's the way we think.
Mm-hmm.
And that simply is not true for Greek language and what is embedded within the verb. The primary aspect that's embedded in each of the verbs is aspect. So that would either be perfective or imperfective. Perfective is you're outside the action and you're observing it either as a whole or as a summary, but you're outside. So it's what they call remote or away from you.
Mm-hmm.
And linguistics uses the term remoteness, and they have remoteness associated with them. So those are for the perfective aspect. The imperfective aspect is when you're inside and the action is occurring close to you somehow. And so it's primarily this idea of spatiality and perspective that you're dealing with Greek verbs in the in terms of what's embedded,
Mm-hmm.
the core, what's called the core semantic value, which it's irreducible. It can't be, there's nothing cancelable about it. Because a lot of people, when they talk about Greek verbs, they go, well, that's a present tense, so that means this.
Mm-hmm.
And they immediately point to a time issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the time is one of those things that's cancelable. In other words, you can't necessarily say that a present tense verb refers to present action,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of time.
Yeah.
So, to get away from that is really, really difficult, but
Yeah.
that's language based, and different languages, embed different core values in the verbal system. So, again, aspect is the key.
Mm-hmm.
Time is constrained, primarily it can be a sort of a sub value to the aspect,
Okay.
and it's imperfective or perfective, but it's secondary.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we can talk about an aorist, which is typically understood to be a past tense, and there's such a thing as a future aorist.
Oh.
Well, how do you have a future? Well, and there's a present aorist. So what do we do with those things? If it's about time, Well, again, those ideas are cancelable in terms of what the core values of the verb are. So, and then to your third idea, I would say with action sart is the kind of action or the kind of activity or the, you know, the type. So, did it happen over a period of time intermittently? Did it happen continuously? Did it happen at a single point in time as a single event? And that is not encoded in the verb. And that's what everybody wants to think they can encode in the verb.
Mhm.
In the Greek verbal system, that is not encoded in the verb. That is a matter of context. It's always constrained by the context. And that's where I would say you really cannot claim to have control of a particular verb and say, this is what this must be,
Mm.
for instance, present continuous action simply because it's in the present tense. It's like you already got it wrong because you're thinking in terms of English verbs.
Mhm.
And you don't even get the idea of the way the Greek verb communicates. But then in terms of the what we do with that verb, in terms of our present tense, you've got to know the environment.
Mm.
Without the environment, without the context, and I would say without the word discourse, without the discourse involved, you don't really have a way to make a claim in terms of the kind of action. So, I know one of the questions you were sort of alluding to was, what's kind of most important to
Yeah.
get a handle on. I would say it's that. I would say the fact that it's not a time-based verbal system. So you move away from that and look at the context and
Mhm.
say, okay, what is the time? What kind of thing is going on, and how would I know based on the context?
So s- when I was reading through different Greek books and trying to get an understanding, it seemed like there was an agreement as far as tense and aspect, but there was somewhat of a disagreement as far as that third one. What did you call it? Axionar?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Action sart.
Actionsart. And
Yeah.
so, in that being the type of action. And so is that type of action, is that the pragmatic part versus the
That's
semantic part?
that's the pragmatic part,
And so
right?
that you really get through the context and
Yeah,
does a theological bias or sub presupposition play a role in that as well?
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so would that
Well,
be
let's put it this
okay?
way. We're going to approach the text with assumptions. We all
Mhm.
do. We
Right.
all do, based on what we've heard. We approach it with the assumption that Greek is like English verbs, that they're
Mm,
they're all about time.
yeah.
We approach the text with that as a presupposition. So, to be able to get away from that,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I mean, we're going to have those assumptions, but I do think that Actian Sart is usually discoverable as long as we're free to examine the context and look at the clues that we have. Um,
So
and plenty of examples that we can talk about there, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
so with tense and aspect, it would be safe to say you can really find that out in the language, but then in the various possibilities that it could be. But then
Mhm.
it's that third one where the context will drive how to apply it. Discourse, is that accurate? Safe to say?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like just I watch a lot of debates. I've already, I'd mentioned to that before to you offline, and I love watching debates and because not only do I just want to see how people articulate a particular position, but I want to see being free grace guys, I want to see what are people's arguments against free grace and what are people's arguments for whether lordship or, Calvinism, whatever the case is. So I like looking at their arguments and how strong they try to make it. And so
Mhm.
with that, it really is discovered. I find out that people, like you said, bring our Western minds to it and it's always this focus on the present tense means you add ing as the suffix to any verb and it's just a continuing thing and that's where you get this idea of those that practice or they're continuing in sin or you have to have a continuing belief until the end.
Yeah.
How in the Greek language how should we understand the present tense? If time is just secondary, and you mentioned this aspect, if you will,
Yeah,
how do we rightfully understand the present tense in the Greek language? Could you break it down for me, like
sure.
Complete Dummy's Guide to Greek? That's the books I need.
Yeah, and I can give you some parallels to,
Yeah.
English. Maybe some other languages too, but I'll stick with
I,
English.
English is hard enough for me, so
Fair enough. But yeah, if I want to draw some parallels with English, and we do very much the same thing. If I'm standing at the bottom of a cliff and I watch a guy jump off and I say, he jumps, I'm using the present tense. As a matter of fact, I can use a present progressive in English. He is look, he is jumping. He is jumping. Okay.
right.
Constrained by the context. If you know what the context is, you cannot take that as a continuous, ongoing, he's only going to do that once.
Yeah, that's
You know,
true.
in most cases, he's only going to do that once, and it's going to be an event that passes very quickly. So, that being said, I think the primary thing is to see it as something that is what's called proximate.
Hmm.
There's the idea of proximity, that you're in the action in terms of uh, um, the aspect.
Hmm.
The perspective is sort of in the action, and that's helpful. But then in terms of the kind of action, it's always constrained by context. And the while I could give some other examples in
Hmm.
English, I think the first problem is just the Greek present tense and
Hmm.
assuming that it's about time. That's the first faulty assumption.
Okay.
The second faulty assumption comes through with the English translations of substantival participles. And substantival participles are, participle is a verbal adjective, right?
Hmm.
So you've got this verbal adjective and you're adding a definite article to it, which nominalizes it, or in other words, it makes it function as a noun.
Hmm.
So the focus is on the nominalizing of this verbal adjective. So, but because of the translation into English, he who believes, or the one who, right?
Hmm.
The he who overcomes those ideas.
Hmm.
Um, and we'll talk about some things that'll present some issues with that in a minute. But uh, I'm so interested to hear these people who say, "See, it's the one who keeps believing," and I'm like,
Hmm.
no, if it's a substantival participle, it's talking about a believer,
Hmm.
the believer,
Hmm.
or the overcomer, because English has a way to capture that, but most translators don't capture it that way because not every substantival participle will work that way. And let me give you a couple examples. I mean, we
Yeah.
talk about someone who jumps is a jumper,
Right.
someone who robs is a robber. So that's how we capture that idea. And so if I say, well, he's a jumper or he's a robber, did I tell you how many times he did it?
Hmm.
Did I tell you whether or not it was an ongoing action? Right? So,
That's
but
a good point.
because of the way that it's captured in English, we assume that, well, whoever translated it put it into a present tense verb
Mm.
when actually it was a noun, it was functioning as a noun in the original context. And I can give you a good example of a substantival adjective that uses a present participle in Matthew 27, where Judas is referred to as who betrayed Jesus.
Hmm.
But actually, in the Greek, it's Judas the betraying.
Mm.
It's a present participle. So, if we were to be honest in terms of the typical way that might get translated, is Judas the one who betrays him.
Hmm.
So, well, it's present tense participle. Shouldn't we say that Judas is always betraying Jesus?
Right.
He's continuously and constantly betraying Jesus. Well, that's nonsense.
No. Yeah.
It's absolute nonsense. So, but that is the typical procedure because of those faulty assumptions of, if it's present tense, that must be ongoing action. False. you know? And then when we see something that's a substantival participle, we say, well, it has a tense form, so
Mhm.
it must have a tense meaning. That's
Mm.
false also. Those are two faulty assumptions.
So what I'm learning just from the basics and what you're articulating there is the fact that a lot of times I'm finding what's translated as these ing present tense time duration verbs
Yeah.
that I'm finding that they have definite articles attached to them, making them function as nouns, like you're saying. And it's not saying that as long as you continue to believe, but it's like you're saying, they're believers, they're believing ones. It's identifying a type or a class or a kind of person as opposed
Character
to what they're
trait.
doing.
Yeah. Character trait, identity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's
And
functioning as a noun. So, if we were doing that in English, we would say believer, robber, right?
mhm,
Jumper, someone who does banking is a banker. I mean, there are so many examples we could, um,
and I
you know, one who receives, one who receives, it's present tense. But when you talk about receiving, how many times do you do that? You,
yeah,
the receiver of
whatever, yeah.
yeah, like I receive it one time and now I have it. So,
It,
you know, t-
that's
yeah,
very important because, like I said, a lot of times these arguments from conditionalists is based solely on the present tense. And again, I don't think necessarily these are, Greek scholars making this argument, but like you said earlier, that people have this first year Greek under their belt and they're like, see, I got the Greek present tense, continuation. And therefore, if you're not continuing in the faith, then you're not truly a believer. And it's the danger of the knowing 1 year of Greek and not all these nuances and not divorcing our Western minds to a Greek text. And
yeah,
so, one thing that through my studies and research of the Greek language, every Greek book that I've read said that participles are the most difficult thing to master. And
absolutely.
so,
Yeah,
why is that? In English, participles, from my understanding, is your suffix of ed and ing, right? It's either you're running or you drove or whatever. If past tense. Why are participles so difficult to understand and master in the Greek?
sure, sure, because they encode verbal ideas and adjectival ideas.
Can you
So their
elaborate?
functionality is, you know, um, have a lot of different kinds of functionality. And, to my earlier point, to be used as a noun, we don't normally do that.
Mhm.
To call, I'm just trying to think to call the one who receives.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Yeah.
That's a present participle. So, not only do we have this verbal adjective that can function like an adjective, it can be tacked on to a helping verb and
Mm.
become part of right? They were being baptized, and that's a participle, those kinds of ideas. So that just becomes more and more complicated as we build the different kinds of functionality into it. But I would say, especially with substantival participles, because they're functioning as a noun, but they don't get translated that way.
Mhm.
It just adds to the confusion. And as English speakers, we don't understand that that's what it's doing. That's what it's encoding. Um,
Now,
and
you had mentioned substantival participles a couple times, and without getting into the Greek text, is there any way someone would know that said verb is actually a substantival participle? Because does that mean that that verb has to have a definite article that is matching with the ending of the Greek verb, and matches is the number, gender, and case, right?
yeah,
And but they won't get that in the English. They'll
mhm,
only get that if you look into the Greek, and then you'll see the ha or the ton or whatever articles there. Is that accurate?
correct. Yes, yes, yeah.
Mm. So with
Yeah,
that, no, good.
but to try to tie tense to a participle is already problematic because you've already made the faulty assumption that the Greek verbal system is primarily about time.
Hmm.
That's already flawed.
Is it
So,
is it also part the perspective of the speaker, like you were talking about the aspect? And I
mhm,
know a lot of Greek books use the illustration or of watching a parade. If you're in a blimp, you're watching the parade from a blimp, you would see that as the perfective aspect, that you see the entire
correct,
parade in one snapshot. Whereas
correct,
if you're on the street, you only see a small part of the parade. You don't see the beginning, the ending. You're just right there in the middle of it, like you were saying. And so you
right.
have that perfect and the imperfect aspect. And so,
Mhm.
would these verbal tenses be more related to the perspective of the author, whether something is contemporaneous with what they're saying, with the main verb, or is there more to it?
Yeah, and it really depends on how it's working, the pragmatics of it, whether it's a narrative or a discourse. I mean, a narrative, a lot of times you'll either find a present as the
Mhm.
main line, but then you've got this idea of you're in the action. So they're trying to make it as though you're right there.
Right there.
But most narrative will typically go with a set of aorists to drive the main line. In other words, the main events in the story,
Hmm.
and then they'll switch to the imperfect,
Hmm.
right? To talk about the backbone, to talk about the things that fill in what
The
was going on
story. Yeah.
around the main events. So it really is tied to what is it doing in the particular kind of discourse that we're looking at.
Okay.
So yeah,
So, so understanding the
I don't know if that
present.
was helpful answer, but
No,
yeah,
it definitely was because you're talking about the aspect of, the heiress giving this summary shot of everything, but then you get this imperfect aspect that they come in and they sort of drill down a little bit to fill in some of the details as far as the larger
right,
parade, if you will. So
yeah,
I find that there are a lot of present tense participles in the New Testament. A lot. Uh, how do
yes,
we really understand present tense participle if it's not the fact of just throwing on an ing at the end of the verb? What's
yeah.
the best way to understand a present tense participle? What's the most common understanding? And then what are some like nuances to it?
Yes, that's a syntax question, and there are a bunch of TULIP temporal,
Mm.
I don't know, probably 9 or 10 different categories that you can throw those in. But to make it easy, really what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I know this is a present participle, but what is its relationship to the main verb? So you're looking at the main verb, you're trying to figure out what the main verb is doing, and then the participle would be the secondary, either contemporaneous going on at the same time. Did it happen before it? Did it happen after it?
Mhm.
And sometimes you'll have what's called a deictic or a time indicator,
Mhm.
and it'll say after or during or
Okay.
before. So if you have those are obviously helpful. But like you said, many times you'll just have that participle hanging there and you go, okay, what's the relationship of this dependent clause that has a participle in it to the main clause with the main verb? And so you got to look at the main verb and then say, okay, I'm looking at this participle, what do I think the relationship might be? And most of the time it's easy, but sometimes
Mhm.
there's debate around it, depending on your theological presuppositions.
And so, and that's something that's not necessarily driven by the Greek itself. It's just the Greek allows for options, and then the context would dictate how you're using that participle.
Yes,
And
correct.
is the easiest way to identify the main verb by finding out the subject, and then what is the subject doing, or how does somebody find the main verb within the Greek?
Yes, yeah, you're looking at the set of clauses that make up the sentence, and sometimes you got to go beyond the sentence into the larger context of the paragraph or whatever. But
Mhm.
most of the time within the sentence, you can kind of say, okay, this is what's happening. Um, this is one of the tensed
Mhm.
verbs, and then you figure out the action of the participle based on that main verb.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So a present tense participle is understanding, okay, the syntax and the interpretation and the nuances. What about aorist? First time I saw this word, I called it aorist, like it's an aortic valve or something. But
Yeah.
what is what is the aorist? I've been told that it really identifies like what is it, a punctiliar or something like that, a point in time. But I've also heard that's not the case necessarily. What is
Yeah.
the aorist, and how should we really understand the aorist form?
Yes. Again, aspect, it would be a perfective one.
Mm.
Back to your example, you're either in the balloon or the drone, contemporary would say, yeah, the drone, right? So,
Yeah, we
same
don't do
idea.
Michelin blimps anymore.
Right, right, right. Unless you're in the Super Bowl. Um, so, you've got that idea of remoteness, right? Where you're looking at the whole thing. But in terms of time, time is secondary. I saw some research that said about 85% of the aorists actually do have a time element, and the time element is past.
Mm.
But that leaves 15% that are not, when you understand them in the context, they're clearly not a past tense in terms of time.
Yeah.
So the most important piece is to understand that they're perfective. In other words, there's some idea of remoteness, right?
Hmm.
You're outside the action, you're overlooking the whole one way or another. Um, and so with the remoteness thing, then you go, okay, well, when did that happen? When did that happen? And there's a classic example I can give you
Okay.
from
Yeah.
Mark,
Hmm.
where there's an exception. And so if you can point to an exception, then you have to be able to say, okay, well, then that's not a core value of the verb.
Hmm.
It's not a core value of that particular tense. You can't say that it's encoded in the tense. And it's in Mark 1, and I believe it's verse 11. Um, and I'll pull that up real quick here
Hmm.
so I can look at it as I'm speaking to you.
Talking about the voice come from heaven saying,
Yes, yes. You are my beloved son in whom I was well pleased.
I've heard that before in the Greek books. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it doesn't work. It
Uh-uh.
doesn't work. But if what you're saying is that it's about aspect, that the primary encoding within the Greek verbal system is aspect, then it's talking about this idea of remoteness. And in that particular context, this is a voice from heaven to someone on earth, right?
Hmm.
So you have this idea of sort of spatial distance
Okay.
when this voice speaks. So the natural way to encode that as far as distance would not be a present tense. It would be an aorist,
So,
because a core value for the aorist is this idea of, perfective. I can oversee the thing as a whole.
remoteness. Yeah.
And I'm looking down, there's this sense of even spatial remoteness in this particular context.
So how would like these aspects of the perfect aspect play in proper interpretation? Like, because we're so focused on time, we're so
Yeah.
time driven, and it's so, even for me to try to wrap my head around some of these things, like that, I can understand what the perfect aspect is.
Yeah.
But typically, when I think of perfect, I think of something that's completed. And I
Yeah.
think of an action that was completed, again, some aspect of a time duration. But that's not necessarily the case in the Greek with the perfective aspect or in the imperfective. So it's really somewhat difficult for me to understand. Okay, when I see this as a present tense in, or whatever aspect it's a perfective aspect, how does it translate into my proper understanding of the verse? Now, even trying to understand the illustration of being in this parade or outside of the parade, still really difficult for me to grasp the concept. And so, any thoughts on how to allow me to fuller understand it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would just tell you, man, I sympathize.
Okay.
Uh,
That doesn't-
Yeah, 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 because you can understand these pieces and say, well, yes, it's an aspectual system. That's the primary encoding. But I think for me, it's more about understanding that's a perspective issue, and the sort of the aorist and the future are more perfective, and the imperfect and the perfect are actually imperfect. Present is imperfective. You know, you have those things going on. So you say, well, okay, I understand that piece, but what can I do with the time in this
Mhm.
context? So, you know, then it becomes a question of, again, going back to this circle of the ever expanding
Mhm.
context and saying, okay, how should I understand it in this context?
So again, driving all the way back to it just seems, again, one of David L. Cooper's, principles of hermeneutics is context, context, context. You know, so all
Yeah,
right. So
yeah,
I did a video on John 5:24, and
yeah.
I have two verses, and I don't know if you have others that you could sort of help with everything, you've been telling us how to practically see these things. But in John 5:24,
Mhm.
and I wish I was on StreamYard, because in StreamYard I can go ahead and share screens, and I don't know, can you share screens on? You actually can. I'm gonna
I
give
think
this.
I think you can allow me to. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's do this real quick. I'm gonna open up Blue Letter Bible. I
Oh,
try
okay.
I tried using Logos before, and yeah, I'm not too many windows going on in there. So I can't really use that. Let's see. How does this happen? No, I don't hardly ever use Zoom. All right, you know what? I'm not even
No
worried
worries.
about it. Don't worry about it. Anyways, John 5:24. John
Mhm,
5:24. I say unto you, he that hears my words and believes on him that sent me has everlasting life,
mhm.
and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life. And from what I remember in 5:24, has everlasting life is written in the present participle, if I'm not mistaken. The present tense, just
Present tense.
present indicative then.
Present
And
active.
so the arguments made is, okay, it's in the present tense indicative, meaning that you have to continue to believe to have everlasting life. So how would you articulate this, since it's not a present participle, it's a present indicative? How would you explain this to someone that doesn't understand the Greek?
Sure, sure. Well, again, this is another one where you don't see necessarily, but again, if you're looking for, you know, indicators that you might have a substantival participle, you see that he who hears,
Hmm.
that's actually a substantival participle. So the hearer of my word and believer in him who sent me has eternal life. So if you're going to play the game of present tense as ongoing action, the only place you'd be able to do that is that you have ongoing and continuous eternal life. Why? Because you're a hearer and believer. And then you have to ask the question, okay, what does it mean to be, you know, how many times do I have to hear and how many times do I have to believe? Well, that you have to answer from a larger context, because there are so many places in the Gospel of John, including John 3, where it becomes very, very clear that belief is that, like Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. To the best of my knowledge, in Genesis 15, you know, God promised him something, Abraham believed. Done.
That's interesting because you bring it up, because I bring up Blue Letter Bible on my phone, and he that hears and he that believes. And a lot of times people want to focus on the present tense being a continuation of things, but he that hears and he that believes are both, those are present participles. And
What, and
so
substantival. So
they are
they're nouns, they're functioning
right.
as nouns. And that's what you don't see in the English translation.
Right, but it's interesting to me when people are making this argument from the conditional perspective, saying you have to continue to believe because of the present tense. Well, also present tense, just from the basic level, is the hearing and the believing. And so would it make sense to argue against them? Be like, if you're saying you have to continually believe, you also have to continually hear and continue, do all these things, just to show the fallacy of that position. And
Yeah,
and
well,
I
there are easier places to do that, and especially in terms of what's constrained by the
Mhm,
context. You know, John 3, for instance,
Hmm.
If I go to John 3, let me get there for and everybody knows this passage because of John 3:16, which is another verse that they say, see, whoever believes, whoever continues to believe in him, right?
Yeah.
Do not perish. And they go that route, but they completely ignore 14 and 15. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Well, the illustration is the serpent in the wilderness.
Mm.
Exact, same thing, just like, and he uses it just like Moses in the wilderness. Well, the serpent got lifted up and the people had been bitten, so they're dying.
No.
How many times did they have to look?
Right.
you know and was it that walking through the wilderness looking at the serpent on the stick, and as long as they keep their eyes on the stick, you know again, constraint by the context
Yeah.
tells you that's nonsense. It's a nonsense issue to in terms of spiritual birth, in terms of the serpent in the wilderness. You have a lot of those ideas that this really don't add up. First John, several examples of that where there's just tremendous inconsistency in terms of the way they tackle it. And they say, well, it means continuous ongoing action here, but not in this other place, but we're not going to apply the same method or tie together an idea that's tied together by the author. We
Yeah.
won't tie those ideas together.
And, I'm not trying to be mean or rude, but what I find from conditionalists is they focus so much on time duration to the neglect of divorcing it from the context, the immediate context. And one thing that I'm
Absolutely.
learning is through First John, I would argue his purpose statement is found in verses 3 and 4 to have the fullness of the fellowship, fullness of joy by being in fellowship with God. And that's really what the letter is about. And throughout
Yeah.
the letter, he's writing clearly to believers. He calls them believers. They have been born again and all these other types of things, but yet they get to a verse like in First John 3:9, which is the next one I want to ask you about. And it says in First John chapter 3, verse number 9, whosoever is born of God does not practice sinning, does not practice sin or continue in sin, or this aspect of they don't have a habitual life of sin. And if
Yeah.
somebody does live habitually in sin, then it's evident to the conditionalist that they've never been born again and they're not a genuine believer. But through my
Yeah.
study of First John 3:9, certain translations say, no, it's a if you do sin. And another translation says if you continue or practice sin. There's a big difference between if you do sin or if you continue and practice in sin. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts on 3:9 as far as is this something that whosoever is born of God doesn't sin, or whosoever is born of God doesn't practice sinning?
Yeah, and in the context, you really have to draw a larger piece of the discourse. Um, you know, whoever 9, he's been born of God, does not sin, for his seed remains in him. His seed remains in him, and that's a present, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he cannot sin. He's not able to sin is more maybe a little more literal, because he has been born of God, and there you have a perfect,
Mm-hmm.
perfect passive. So you've got a lot going on, but in the larger context, it becomes really clear that this is not pointing to activity. It's actually pointing to identity.
Mm.
And so it's the nature of your new identity, right? To do right. And if we're talking about Christ and who is within me, someone who is within me,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I'm acting in line, if I'm abiding in him and I'm acting in line with that new nature that he's given me, can I sin if I'm acting in line with that new nature? Of course not. Of course not. Now, my flesh, even Paul said, I know that no good thing dwells in me,
Yep.
that is in my flesh. And, I always love to ask people, well, are you capable of sinning? And then try to make about this, continuing thing. But this is pretty clear. He's not able. He's not able to sin, is the second part of the clause. He's not able to. So, are you able to? You know? And he said, well, no, it's about practicing. It's about your performance over time. It's like, well, wait a minute. It says if you're not able to.
Yeah.
So, and not able is an ongoing present tense according to you.
With this in
It
the
doesn't work,
it
you know.
it doesn't.
No.
But somehow the word what poieo being the fact that I believe it's a present indicative
Yeah.
is being translated with that ing suffix again, this aspect of continuing. And so
Is
again,
not
it
doing is not
go,
doing. Yeah. Which again, if you weren't constrained by the context, and especially the larger discourse of First John, you might be able to draw that conclusion, but not based on tense.
right.
You still have to say, I start with aspect, and then I take a glance at the text to say, okay, knowing that this or knowing that this tense can play different roles,
Hmm.
let's look at the pragmatics and say, okay, how's it functioning right here? And for the second part of that to say he's not able, and that's a present tense. You can't put those two together and have it work and try to say that if you're not if you're practicing,
Yeah.
you know,
I look back at verse number 6 too, because in verse number 6 says, "Whosoever abides in him doesn't sin."
right, right,
And so when I've studied this, it gives me the idea of this aspect in the tense of when we abide in Christ, we don't sin, like you were saying.
yeah,
And so it
and
is the moment that, as long as we're abiding, we don't sin. The moment we leave fellowship, that's when we leave to the fleshly side, the nature, the Romans 7 part, where, like you said, that's the part of man that I would say, commits the sin,
right,
not the spirit side, the new creation side. But
right. Yeah, I have a new nature. I'm a new creature in Christ. Old things passed away, and that's stated as a fact, right?
mhm,
But experientially, we still experience our fallenness. So what do you do with that? And
right.
to try to say that it's this ongoing practicing of something, to what degree, is it a 10% slide? Is that okay? Or, 30 or 40% slide? Is that, well, I'm good 60%, I'm performing
Yeah.
properly 60 or 70% of the time. Well, is that okay? Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, and then I just can't help the fact that it places the assurance, security, and the maintenance of salvation on a person's works rather than on the finished work of Christ.
Yes,
But
yeah,
these are
yes.
two verses personally that I had to get into the Greek to find out, what's going on. First John 3:9 being the fact that why is there such a disconnect between certain translations, whether it's practicing, continuing, or just, doing a sin. But then in John 5:24 is when I really first found out about substantival participles and the aspect that no, this is just a noun that is written in like a verb form, but it's a noun. And so,
Yes.
are there any other verses that are common that people misunderstand because they don't understand what's going on with the Greek?
Yeah, I would say, well, again,
Say John
pointing
3:16.
to the apostle John. Apostle John uses more substantival participles than any other New Testament author.
Hmm.
So, we as free grace people, we point to that and we say, see, believe, but believe once,
Hmm.
and you have a new identity, and then you move on from there, and the Holy Spirit convicts you, and you grow, and that's the way we think.
Hmm.
Uh, and they're trying to make it say something else, but the basis for both sides is very often we play the tense game. We
Mm.
play our understanding of the tense instead of saying, well, wait a minute, look, he's using a substantival participle here again. Even you were talking about um, let's see, First John 3:6. You were like, whoever abides in him, every abider in him does
Mhm.
not sin. But then the next phrase is every sinner has neither seen him nor known him. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
all the sinning, each sinning one, would be a very literal translation.
Yeah, because you got that definite article "ha" in there right before the
Yep.
words for sin, Martian.
Yeah. And it's all over John, First John, Second John, Third John, Revelation 1 and 2, or I'm sorry, Revelation 2 and 3 with the seven churches, with what I would say is the overcome.
Mm-hmm.
The injustice that's been done by translating it as the one who overcomes, and then they verbalize this thing that has just been nominalized.
Huh.
Because in every single instance for each of the seven churches, it's about a person or people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's focusing on them as to their character or identity. And so then you say, well, okay, if it's about an overcomer and not the
What
action
they're
of
doing.
overcoming,
Mm-hmm.
that's what's in the present tense. So I have to keep on overcoming. That's not in there. It's not encoded in anything in Revelation 2 and 3. That's just not
Mm.
there. But you have some translations that do horrible things with that. And I can point to two: the Spanish, which was translated by Catholic priests,
Okay.
you think might affect things. The Russian translation, which was translated by Russian Orthodox folks.
Mm.
So you've got those ideas, and they come to a passage like Revelation 2 and 3, and they see this word overcome, and they go, how are we
Yeah.
going to translate that? But it's functioning as a noun.
Yeah.
It's talking about a person as an overcomer. So what makes you a victor or a conqueror or an overcomer? And we know the answer to that from 1 John 5. Who is
Right.
the one who overcomes? Who is the overcomer? And literally that's the same thing. Who is the overcomer? The one who believes that Jesus,
Yep.
believes in Jesus.
It is.
So
So the
yeah.
key. So would it be safe to say the key to find out if a verb is a noun is the definite article? It's
Yes.
like I go back to First John 3:8, and you're right, because as I'm doing this expositional study, I'm finding a lot of substantival participles, even in 3:8, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but the translation goes, "He that commits sin is of the devil." But in the Greek, it reads as "Ha poieton ton amartian ek tu diablo." And so
Mm-hmm.
you have one, two,
Doer.
three definite articles, and so they're all nouns,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
so okay, and I know I mispronounced. How do you pronounce that third definite article? The
I'd have to look. You said
is
First John
tau
3,
omicron and the U with the mark above it
2. I would say 2, but
too.
you know,
Okay,
some people do those diphthongs a little bit differently. But
okay. So
yeah,
yeah, that was one right there that I've noticed, that you have three definite articles
yeah,
in 7 words. Three of them are definite articles, three or four. And
yeah.
so, all right. So
Definite article is huge in terms of Greek language and its functionality. Yeah, yeah.
all right.
But
So yeah, good.
I just in the top of my head, one of the things that I love to ask people is, okay, you're trying to tie tense to these participles that are functioning as nouns, and you're trying to say that because it has a present tense form, that it must encode ongoing action. I'm like, okay, if you want to run that route, let's go to Romans 4.
Okay.
One of my favorite passages to reference when people try to play that game, because it doesn't work. Again, built on several faulty assumptions. But
Mm-hmm.
um, if you look at verses 4 and following,
Yeah.
to the worker, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt.
Mm-hmm.
But to the non-worker, but believer, on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. To the one who does not work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Present active participle, but functioning as a noun,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you're either a worker or you're a non-worker. Those are your two categories,
Hmm.
and you're falling into one of the two categories.
Oh,
You're you're either a worker or you're a non-worker who's a believer, and you're a believer because you're a non-worker. So, if you want to play the present tense game, so what that means is that in order for me to be a believer, I have to continually and in a prolonged process across my life not
Not
work.
work.
That's what it says. That's what that's what it says. So if
That's
we're going to be
pretty
honest
good.
with the text and be consistent in our
That's pretty good. I'm gonna have to keep a note of that one. You have to continually not work to be saved.
yeah,
Yeah, because that's the thing. What I'm learning is there's just an inconsistency of carrying this Western idea of tense forward. Because there are some verses where you want to, if we're being consistent, we'll throw the present tense time duration in other passages, and it clearly makes no sense whatsoever. And
yeah.
so it's got to at least be evident that the present tense isn't tied mainly into time. But all right, so like I said, going through First John, I'm coming across a couple different Greek words for the word no. One is commonly used gnosko. Oh yeah,
Right.
and
Yeah.
then the other one I'm gonna mispronounce it. That's okay, but Ido, Eido. Is that the right pronunciation? How do you pronounce it?
I would probably say 8-0, but I
Ado.
normally
Okay,
say oida, which is the perfect form.
Ado.
But
All right.
yeah,
So, what's the difference between gnosko and Ado?
yeah. And that's a matter of usage too. But I really, it's an interesting distinction. Um, what I have seen, and if you read it and you're trying to notice when you see that with gnosko and when you see oida, some form of ado or oida in the
Let's
text.
let's take for instance First John 2:29.
Okay.
He uses a
Let
form
me
of Ado and gnosko in the same verse. In First John 2:29, it says, "If you know that he is righteous, you know that everyone that doeth righteousness is born of him." The first no is Ado. The second no is gnosko.
Perfect.
This
And I
is a
would say
verse.
that's consistent with what I have studied in relationship to the distinction between them. That
Okay.
oida is more of the perception or intuition,
Mhm.
something that's you know perception that's it's not necessarily tied to experience, whereas gnosko is tied to experience, so that by some kind of interaction or experience.
And would you say those would be like because I hear it thrown around a lot that, these words aren't technical. I mean, there's other definitions, I guess. Is that what someone means when they say it's not a technical word or whether something is? What do they mean by that?
Yeah.
Any idea?
Yeah, they're trying to say it's not a technical expression, like certain terms in the New Testament. I know, some of the grace people talk about sons of the kingdom as a technical expression. It's like, no, it's only used twice, and it's used, I would argue, differently in the two places where it does occur. So it's hard to make a technical expression of that. Um, and to say it's only understood in a certain way. I mean, almost every verb has a range of meaning or a
Meanings.
range of
Yeah.
ideas associated with it. But I think we can see pretty consistently. And I would use as another example, if you're familiar with blepo, harao, and
Hmm.
theoreo, they're all translated in English as see,
See. Hmm.
but they have different ideas associated with them once you start studying them and seeing where they occur. That theoreo is, working with an interpreter, and he said, "Well, wouldn't you just translate that as stare?" And I thought, that's really would be a good translation, because when you're staring, unfortunately, staring, we hear that as a negative, like,
Yeah.
you're staring at that person, stop staring, right? So we
Yeah.
hear it as a negative, but the idea he was trying to share was, it's like you're looking at them, but you're not just looking at, you're studying. You're
Mm.
kind of analyzing when you're looking at them.
Yeah.
So it's more than just, I saw that.
Yeah.
Whereas blepo is a simple visual,
Mm.
reception of
Sight.
something. And harao is somewhere in the middle, and then theoreo is we get the word theory from it, or theorize.
Mm.
So, but English translations, 99.75% of the time, if you look at an English translation, they're just going to say see.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's helpful. Those are helpful distinctions. And I would say there's a reason why they chose to use oida instead of gnosko.
And then and it just goes back to, I guess, one's view of the inspiration of scripture, I guess, as well. Because if
Yeah.
someone were to take a verbal plenary view, then they would see, okay, there's a reason why you have these two different Greek words, which in the English mean the same, but in the Greek, there's a different nuance. So they're there specifically because God has a reason for them being there. And if they
Yes.
were meant to be the same word, no, it would have just been the same Greek word. But it seems like the Spirit's trying to draw a distinction between the first use and then the second use of different words. And
Yeah.
so, like I
Yeah.
said in the very beginning, it's an aspect on, is it necessary to know Greek to understand the Bible? Not necessary, but is, I love how you put it. It's helpful. I like that. It definitely makes it just it definitely helps clarify some things, and but I appreciate that. So those are pretty much all the questions I really had for you for today. I know I got ask a whole bunch more, but I mean,
Well, this is
I
fun.
don't I don't know how long we can go with that, but knowing you're in outside of where are you at? You're in Georgia, right?
Yes, I'm southeast of Atlanta.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's that's one city I don't do well with. I don't like Atlanta.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
no, I appreciate your time, Tom. So is there any last minute things you'd like to say or share as we wrap this up and say bye to everybody?
Thank you for your time. I know, a lot of what we share today is kind of a higher level, you can limit your audience. And I appreciate that. But, some of what we shared was incredibly relevant to, sort of the world of theology and how we present, uh, scripture and our beliefs to other people. And I know for me, the fact that I can know that I'm a citizen, I can know that I'm a son, I can know that I'm the bride of Christ. I'm part of the bride of Christ. I'm a
Mhm.
member of the body of Christ. And I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about being a good member of the body of Christ. I'm
Yeah.
worried about being a waiting bride, for the groom when he comes back.
Uh,
Just that difference, um, for anybody out there who's hearing everything else we shared, that alone should be just amazing. Amazing. That's where I would say when you get that, when you see that Jesus finished the work on the cross and we trust him, he makes us a new creature. God gives us new birth, and it's there. And then we have it. We possess it.
Amen.
Uh, then it's a matter of gratitude. Then it's a matter of what, if I can experience love, joy, and peace
Mhm.
and a relationship with the creator of the universe where he looks down on me and smiles, why would I want to have anything else? Why, they always point a finger at me and go, well, you're just telling people they can just go sin. I'm like, I never said that. And number two, if you understand grace, if you understand what God
Yep.
did in salvation,
Yep.
what motive would you have to sin? It
Yep.
doesn't, that doesn't work for me either. Um,
No, it's just what Paul said, Romans 6:1. Should we sin that grace may abound? He says, God forbid. How
it's
can
not.
we? And the big difference is we serve not for salvation, but because of salvation. It's that aspect of gratitude. And
Yeah.
so, well, Dr. Professor Tom Eckman, probably Mr. as well, Mr. Dr. Professor Tom Eckman, and all these degrees under your belt. I appreciate your time, and I regret to inform you that I probably will still bother you a time or two when I'm like, hey, I think this is what I'm understanding. Can you see it? Let me know where I'm wrong. And I do appreciate your honesty.
Bring it on, brother. Just we're
So
we're all in we're all on the journey together.
there
So
you go. So do you have any links, any ministries that you've founded, supported, anything you'd like to share before we actually close?
sure, sure. I mean, we're right now. My primary ministry is involved with Iranian or Persian refugees,
Hmm.
and they have developing Timothy's and teaching through the Bible expositionally and working on a translation. So, but I'm the grace guy. So if you
Good.
go on YouTube, Grace Guy Tom Eckman, you'll find me.
There we go. We'll have links in the description of this video as well. So thanks for everybody else that's still checking it out. Go ahead, like, comment, share, subscribe, blah, 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 blah. You know what to do. And until next time, God bless.